Erev Tov Rabotai, we're continuing with our Mishna Yomi Masechet Maasrot. We're up to Perek Mishnah Hey. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'en Nishmat Neria ben Svetlana Aranbayev and Eliyahu ben Burcha Israelov Menuchatam Began Eden. Amen. Today's Mishnah is going to deal with produce grown in Syria, which is the lands of Aram, which were conquered and annexed to Eretz Israel by David HaMelech. These lands that Tefillat Israel says are to the northeast of Eretz Israel, and the Rav explains for some halachot they are considered like Eretz Israel, and for other halachot they are not. Midrabanan, by rabbinic law, produce grown by a Jew in Syria is subject to Tirumot and Maasrot, but produce grown there by a non-Jew is not. The Mishnah is going to discuss the halacha if a Jew buys produce in Syria while it is still growing. Haloker sedei yarak b'Syria. If a Jew buys a field of vegetables in Syria from a non-Jew, the status of the vegetables depend on who owns them at the stage of Maasrot, which we said that the stage of growth when the laws of Maasrot take effect is known as the stage of Maasrot. This is spoken about in chapter 1, Mishnah 2-4. Im ad shelo ba leonat Maasrot chayav. If the Jew bought the field before the vegetables reach the stage of Maasrot, chayav, the vegetables are subject to Maasrot, because when they reached the stage of Maasrot and the laws of Maasrot took effect, the vegetables were owned by a Jew, and Jewish-owned produce in Syria is subject to Maasrot midrabanan. But if he bought the field after the vegetables reached the stage of Maasrot, patur, the vegetables are exempt from Maasrot because they were owned by a non-Jew when the laws of Maasrot would have taken effect, and produce of a non-Jew in Syria is not subject to Maasrot. Viloket kidarko veolech. In this case, the Jewish buyer may harvest the vegetables in his usual manner, meaning he may allow the vegetables to continue to grow and harvest them at the usual time, even though they will continue to grow while owned by a Jew, who he still does not have to separate Maasrot. And the Mefarshim explain the status of the vegetable is decided at the time when the obligations of Maasrot take effect. Since at that time the vegetables belong to a non-Jew, they are considered produce grown by a non-Jew, regardless of what happens later. However, he must harvest the vegetables himself. The Mefarshim explain he may not hire workers to do the harvesting because the rabbis were concerned that people might confuse the Mishnah's halacha and assume that even produce bought before the stage of Maasrot is exempt from Maasrot. Therefore, the rabbis issued a restriction. They said even where the produce is indeed exempt, meaning it was bought after the stage of Maasrot, it may not be harvested by workers. This restriction serves as a reminder that the exemption applies only in limited circumstances, specifically where the sale took place after the stage of Maasrot. Rabbi Yehuda says, Af yisko po'anim vilkot. He may even hire workers to harvest the vegetables. The Mefarshim explain, Rabbi Yehuda is not concerned that people are going to confuse his halachot, and therefore he holds there is no decree against hiring workers for the harvest. Now the next Tana disagrees with the first opinion we quoted, Tana Kama, on a different point. The next Tana holds that even vegetables owned by a Jew at the stage of Maasrot are sometimes exempt from Maasrot. Amar Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, B'met dvarim amurim. When were these things said? Meaning, in what case are vegetables bought before the stage of Maasrot subject to Maasrot? Bizman shekana karka. That's when the Jew bought the land along with the vegetables. Aval bizman shelo kana karka. But if he did not buy the land, but he merely bought the vegetables, im ad shelo ba leonat Maasrot patur. Then even if he bought them before they reached the stage of Maasrot, patur, they are exempt from Maasrot, because according to Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, the very fact that the vegetables grew on a non-Jew's land exempts them from Maasrot, even if the vegetables were owned by a Jew at the stage of Maasrot, because produce in Syria is subject to Maasrot only if a Jew owns both the produce and the land it's on when it reaches the stage of Maasrot. Whereas the Tana Kama disagrees and he holds, even if the Jew just bought the produce but not the land, the produce is subject to Maasrot. And the Rav actually tells us, Halakha ki Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, the halakha follows Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. Now the next Tana disputes another aspect of the Tana Kama's ruling. The Tana Kama, the original opinion we quoted, he ruled that if the vegetables were owned by a non-Jew at the stage of Maasrot, even the part that grows after the sale is exempt from Maasrot. However, Rabbi disagrees. Rabbi says, Af lefi cheshbon, even if a Jew bought vegetables after the stage of Maasrot, he must separate Maasrot by proportion, meaning he must separate for whatever percentage of the vegetables grew after the sale, but not for the percentage that grew before the sale. For example, if at the time of the sale the vegetable had grown a third, he does not have to separate Maasrot for that third, he only has to separate Maasrot for the remaining 2/3. And the Mefarshim explain, the Tana Kama taught that the status of the produce is based on its condition at the stage of Maasrot. If it was not owned by a Jew at that time, it's completely exempt, whereas Rabbi disagrees. He holds that the fact that a non-Jew owned the produce at the stage of Maasrot does not mean that it's completely exempt. It just means that the portion that grew while owned by a non-Jew is exempt, but the part that grew under Jewish ownership must be tithed. Rabbi, however, would agree that in the opposite case, where a Jew owned the vegetables at the stage of Maasrot, that he must separate Maasrot for the full amount, including the part that grew while it was owned by a non-Jew, because since they were owned by a Jew at that time when the obligation of Maasrot took effect, that obligation took effect in the usual manner, meaning on the entire vegetable. However, when the obligation of Maasrot does not take effect at the usual time, according to Rebbe, it does not take effect fully, and the part that grew while owned by a non-Jew is exempt from Maasrot. And again, the Rav tells us, Halakha ki Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, the Halakha follows the opinion of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel. And that is in Rabotai Mishnah. Hey, Mishnah Vav now is going to deal with the obligation of separating Maasrot from Temed. Temed is a drink produced by soaking wine sediment in water. The sediment, which contains a small amount of wine, releases droplets of wine into the water and flavors it. The resulting mixture tastes like low-quality wine. The Mishnah says, Ham tamed v'natan mayim b'midah. If someone made temed and he poured a measure of water onto wine sediment and allowed it to soak, umatzah kidei midato, and when the temed was ready, he found that the amount of temed was the same as the measure of water that he originally poured in. For example, he poured 3 jugs of water onto sediment and he ended up with 3 jugs of temed, patur. This temed is exempt from Maasrot because since the measure of liquid did not noticeably increase, the sediment obviously did not add a significant amount of wine to the beverage, and therefore the temed is not considered wine, but merely wine-flavored water, which is not subject to the maaser obligation. The Mefarshim explain, even though there are traces of wine in the drink, the concept of bitul barov, nullification by majority, teaches us that when 2 substances are mixed, the majority substance cancels out the minority one. So the small amount of wine is canceled out by the larger amount of water. And even though tever does not become nullified in a mixture, if it gives flavor to the mixture, here, even though the sediment flavors the water, it does not give the water the full taste of wine, but some sharpness. That's not enough of flavor to prevent the wine from becoming nullified. Therefore, this wine would become nullified. Now, the Mefarshim continue to explain, even if the liquid increases a little, it's still considered water. The temed is considered wine and would be subject to Maasrot only if the liquid increased to the point that the wine is 25% of the total. Meaning, for example, if he put in 3 jugs of water and he increased to 4 jugs, the extra liquid, which is the 25% of the total amount of temed, is obviously all wine. And the Mefarshim explain, in the earlier times, wine was always diluted with water. 1 part wine was mixed with 3 parts water, 25% wine. Since this is the way wine was drunk, if it contains this percentage of wine, the wine is significant enough that it's not nullified. Similarly, the Mefarshim explain, based on the Gemara in Baba Batra, page 96b, if the temed contains 25% wine, the blessing over wine, according to some Mefarshim, would be borei pri gefen. If it has less than 25% wine, the blessing would be like over water. Again, this is not halakha per se. This is just brought down by some of the Mefarshim. Now, the next Tana holds that another factor has to be considered when calculating the amount of wine in the temed, the fact that the sediment absorbs some of the water. Rabbi Yehuda mechayev. Rabbi Yehuda considers the temed subject to Maasrot even if the liquid increased by only half a jug, because Rabbi Yehuda holds that in this case, the temed in fact contains a full jug's worth of wine. The reason the liquid didn't increase by a full jug is because half a jug's worth of water was absorbed into the wine sediment. Therefore, the beverage began with 3 jugs of water, and it now contains 2.5 jugs of water and 1 jug's worth of wine. So since more than 25% of the mixture is wine, because one jug is about 29% of 3.5 jugs, the beverage is obligated in Maasrot. And the Rav tells us, the halacha does not follow Rabbi Yehuda. The Mishnah continues to explain how Maasrot are separated from temed when it would be subject to Maasrot. If he found that the measure of the temed was significantly more than the original measure of water, meaning the liquid increased to the point that the wine is 25% of the total, so now Maasrot have to be separated. What you do is, you may separate Maasrot from it from a different place, meaning for other wine. Just like a person always has the option of separating Maasrot from one barrel of wine for a different barrel of wine, like we spoke about in Masechet Tirumot, chapter 1, halacha 5. Right? He may separate Maasrot from it from a different place according to the proportion of wine in the temed, meaning he doesn't have to separate Maasrot for the entire volume of temed, but only for the part of it that is wine. For example, if the temed contains 1 jug's worth of wine, he has to separate Maasrot for 1 jug's worth. And the Mefarshim explain, if he wishes, the owner can separate Maasrot from the temed itself instead of from other wine. But if he does that, he's going to have to separate Maasrot for the full amount of temed and not just for the wine. So for example, if a quarter of the temed is wine, only that amount is subject to Maasrot. Therefore, for Maaser Rishon, which is 1/10 of the produce, you would have to separate 1/4 of 1/10 of the temed. But if you separate part of the temed itself as Maaser, only 1/4 of what you separate is actually wine. The other 3/4 is water. Since water cannot serve as Maaser, you're going to end up having to separate a full 1/10 of the temed as Maaser Rishon. But again, that's how the Mefarshim explain if you want to go in that route. And that is in Rabotai of today's Mishna Yomi. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.